Well, I talk to you guys about 4 or 5 times a year, and I always say what I'm going to say again. The real fun part of giving the message in 11:11 is getting to pick the music and having Brad say, yeah, we can do that. These guys are just so amazing. And so when I first gave him a list of songs, Brad is so funny. He said, yeah, it's a lot of really good 70s music. And so I said, well, of course, I'm an aging hippie. What do you think? So that's when I pulled out the Black Eyed Peas and Where's the Love, because I still know some music that wasn't born in the 70s. But I want to talk about the Piano Man. Billy Joel is an American institution, right? I even saw some of you 30-year-olds singing along. You may have seen the PBS special that honored him for receiving the 2014 Gershwin Award given by the Library of Congress. This award goes to one person each year who uses the genre of song to promote cultural understanding, to entertain us, of course, and to inform us and to inspire new generations. And so this Piano Man is an example of Billy Joel's ability to combine music and storytelling. But I am focusing on the way that the lyrics of that song weave together little vignettes of the stories of the people in the bar. There's Paul, the real estate novelist, the waitress practicing politics, Davy, who's still in the Navy, and so forth. It's a room full of stories, just like this one. What we know about their stories is sad. It seems like there's a lot of longing and unfulfilled dreams, right? But maybe if we, look on the brighter side, maybe it's dreams that have not yet been fulfilled. But what I'm really noticing is that the songwriter knew their stories. Somebody knew their story. And I think that's sort of why the song endures. People keep on coming back to it, and maybe it's not just people my age with all the nostalgia of remembering that song when we wore a younger man's clothes, as the song says. Maybe it's also that people of every generation come back to this song because it's about loneliness and coming together. Loneliness and coming together. And so I think that we know inside of us that seeking community is where we find salvation. That knowing one another's story has a way of saving us. Everybody wants validation. That's a desire that every person has. We become just a little bit more convinced of our own worth when somebody else knows a little bit of our story. And most of us need some doses of that every day. I need 2 or 3 doses of knowing, did you hear me? Did you see me? We're not alone in wanting that. Do not ever think you're alone in wanting to be seen and heard. Okay, yes, sometimes we all work just a little too hard at that. We work too hard at getting attention. And, it's useful to think about that and maybe, pay attention, because sometimes we work too hard and it has the opposite effect and it drives people away. But if you've ever done that, if you've ever worked too hard to get somebody's attention, forgive yourself. We've all done it. Because the real truth is, we all want to be seen and heard. We want someone to know at least part of our story. But it's unfortunate that, in fact, it seems a lot of people are missing that. There's so much written in the social sciences about the fact that people feel more isolated and disconnected than ever. They find it surprising in an age of technology and social media. People feel like they have nobody to confide in. Over half of Americans say they only have their immediate family that they can talk to. And as we know, many of our immediate families are in great distress. And so there's a problem there of disconnection. Robert Putnam is a Harvard sociologist, and he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. The title itself tells a story, doesn't it? And in that book, written in 2000, he's lamenting sort of this loss of community, this loss of connectivity. He notes that people don't seem to be involved as much in groups and clubs and churches as we once were, and so he senses a lack or a diminishing of our connectivity. But we're just not designed to be that way, are we? We're social animals, and so of course we have this great big desire to be heard, to be connected, to feel like that our lives matter to someone else. Now, this feeling of loneliness or being invisible, of course, exists on a spectrum. There's the extreme of it, but there's also the reality that every one of us, throughout our lives, not just one time, throughout our lives, have the experience of feeling lonely, of feeling disconnected. We usually talk about that like this. We say, I'm in a room full of people, and yet I feel alone. Sometimes even among our closest relationships, we still feel like an outsider, like people don't get us. So we know what this feeling is like, right? So wherever we are on that spectrum, what we're talking about is our mental and emotional health. And since we at this church like to think about the integrated self, we like to think about body, mind, and spirit, we are also talking about our spiritual health. It's an article of faith for many of us. For many of us, what it means to be in a Jesus community is that we want to grow into our realization and our conviction that when one person hurts, we all hurt. Social disconnection, as you well know, has been at the heart of the discussions about racism and violence in the last weeks. I remember, as you do, hearing so many stories recently about the efforts in several cities and towns to increase the social capital between citizens and law enforcement. Men and women of all ages, there's this desire to sort of increase that social capital. And it's been heartwarming to hear about and to see TV clips of officers and kids playing basketball together, of black and white officers hugging each other, of hugging others of all faiths and of all colors, and seeing even victims' families through their tears saying, we know that violence is not the answer. We have clung to those stories because we know that somewhere in there is an answer to what we're going through. I read the words of a black physician who lives in Dallas just this week, and he wrote about his fear of policemen, and that, in spite of that fear, he continues his commitment to care for them if that time comes and to save their lives if he is their doctor. He said, I want you to see me as a black man who supports you, and I will care for you, but that doesn't mean, he wrote, that I won't have a visceral fear of you, but I will overcome that fear, and I will take care of you. The writer of the article, putting all of that together, spoke about this man's commitment to overcome his fear. He spoke about it in terms of great maturity. And I think to myself, I believe that doctor telling that story is a vehicle not only for his maturity, but for ours too, as we listen to him say that. When we listen to each other's sadnesses, complaints, and struggles, we learn so much from each other. We learn how to cope with trouble, how to manage our emotions when we listen to each other. And as these stories are reported, we are being reminded of the healing power of community and social connection. You know, sometimes we get the chance to talk to someone about our story and our struggling. And in that, we get this opportunity to hear our own voice. And something about hearing our own voice can help us think through our issues more clearly. That person who's listening to us might have something wise to say, but there's really something important about being provided the sacred space to speak our stuff. I've noticed this a lot in my office where I work as a mentor and a life coach. If I just let people talk, maybe ask a question here and there, yeah, but if I just let people talk, I begin sometimes to see people adjusting their own words. It's like they're coming up with another way to frame this, another way to think about and to speak about and to act so that they can work on their problems. I guess hearing our voice is, and someone giving us the space to speak is a sacred gift. Well, I think we all know, of course, that racial divides are certainly not the only causes of trauma in our culture. I read this last week about the Coming Home Project. I'm so excited to have run across this. It's an organization whose purpose is to tend to the unseen wounds of the families of soldiers as well as the returning veterans. They recognize, this group does, the loneliness and the anguish of the families who grieve while their loved ones are deployed, and of course who grieve if they don't get to come home. But they also recognize the pain of the returning soldier who comes with mental and spiritual injuries that persist. And the core of this organization's work is the recognition of the need to be heard. The families need to talk, the soldiers need to talk, and to be able to share their grief with people around them who have the courage to enter into that grief with them is a component of their healing. So I guess in the end, this sermon is a call to courage to increase our own willingness to share our stories and to listen to others. Sharing, of course, is a two-way experience. We listen and we talk. But if we can listen with our ears and our eyes and our bodies and without judgment, we are making big contributions in the bank of social capital. I remember this time in my life when I got the chance to help a guy kind of ratchet down himself on his anger scale. He was really mad. I could see him from a distance. He was acting out. He was cursing at everybody who went by. He was about to really be in trouble. He was so angry. He happened to turn around and see me. And when he did, he kind of froze a little bit, and then he just put his head down. I walked toward him, and he and I walked away from the trouble he was just about to get into. I chalk all of that up to having made a lot of deposits in the social capital bank with him. And he had made deposits in my bank too. But this is your story. You get this. You've done this before. You've helped people get to a better place. And certainly, if you're like me, you've been helped before. I might not have ever been in exactly that situation, but we help each other get to a better place when we make deposits in that bank of social capital. And we do it by listening and sharing. Now, I'm talking about all this listening and sharing, and oh my goodness, we all know that we're just a little bit scared to share. We're just a little bit scared even to listen. Who knows what in the world we're going to get into if we start listening to somebody. There's a lot of vulnerability to be reckoned with in this business. Best-selling author Brené Brown has put that topic of vulnerability in the mainstream of our conversation. Her TED Talk on the topic and her book, Daring Greatly, pulled that card off the bottom of the deck where we'd probably rather it stay, and she smacked it right in the middle of the table, and she challenged us to understand that all of us fear vulnerability. All of us. Not one of us is left out of that. And she challenged us to know that we are not alone. And by knowing that, we can see that since we're all scared, we might as well jump in here together. We all crazily labor under the illusion that everybody in here's got their life together and I alone am limping along. We're all very vulnerable and fearful like that, right? You know, when I think about all of that, when I think about what Brene Brown has written, and I think about the idea of vulnerability and her point being that, you know, we just need to know that everybody feels the same way. I think about that adage, misery loves company. Well, that's not it. Misery needs company. We need to know that we are all a little bit afraid. We need to know that we all struggle. We need to know that feeling like we're the only person who struggles makes us draw back. And then we don't participate, and the world loses our contribution, and we have a contribution to make. So, sharing brings us to this reality. We are all dependent on each other. We cannot get through this life alone. We're just not going to make it. So maybe, with that realization, we can put down our swords and shields and finally start having a little fun with these great connections that we have. It's hard to have fun when we're scared of ourselves and scared of each other. I've had so many occasions, I bet you have too, of just actually feeling physically better just because I had conversation with somebody. Hearing them talk, letting me talk, it helps physically. I've been lifted from the fog of self-doubt and self-pity by having an encouraging and engaging conversation. I've had many experiences where I got to know somebody better, learning just a little bit more about them, and suddenly I see them differently. Whereas in the past, I was focused on the way they are, the thing they think that I don't think, the way they do things that doesn't make any sense to me. And yet, after spending just a little bit of time listening, I felt more tolerant. And it's easier then to work together because what I learned took up some space in my view of them. And I no longer thought of them only as that person who does things weirdly. This is not to say, of course, I'm not Pollyanna. It's not to say that conversation erases differences, but it is to say that these differences can be diluted. And so we're more willing to work together and less willing to ignore each other and leave each other in isolation. So we have this world of dramatic problems, right? They leave us frightened. They leave us feeling hopeless. It's good to get together and to remind each other of the good stories when conversation has helped us so that we can believe again. What do you come to church for? You probably don't come to hear anything new. You come to think again about what you somehow know is true, but it sort of gets lost in the mix of life. And so it's good to get together and to remind each other and help each other believe again in the power of social connection and to see that we have a role to play in healing the world. Well, it's time to wind down now. I just want to add this at the end. All the great virtues demand that we do something for somebody else, right? That's what we're supposed to do. But the cool thing about all the great virtues is, in fact, it ends up helping us. And so when I share or let you share, it's just making me feel better too. There's a phrase in the Bantu language, which is a language spoken in southern African countries, and the phrase is Ubuntu. And it means something, that's the word, it means something like, I am not myself by myself. I am because you are. A person is a person through other persons. And so the point is, we're going to get to gain a fuller experience of ourselves when we practice knowing someone else's story and letting them know some of ours. It's like the curtains are drawn back, and suddenly there's light, a little more light, and we can see things that we hadn't seen before, just a little more clearly.